The ghost of a soundless valley. Why 3 generations never spoke a single word. Part 1. The Descent. The valley doesn't announce itself. That is the first thing you notice. And the noticing itself feels wrong, feels like a violation of some unspoken contract between you and this place. No birdsong. No rustle of wind threading through high grass. None of the ambient acoustic signatures that ordinarily signal a living landscape. You hear your own footsteps with a clarity that feels almost accusatory, each one a small confession of your intrusion, amplified by the geological bowl of the valley walls rising on all sides like cupped hands holding still water. Harrow's Dip sits at the bottom of this depression in the Welsh borderlands, approximately 11 miles east of Hay-on-Wye, reachable by a single-track road that modern mapping software either refuses to display or routes you away from, as though the algorithm itself has developed a preference for avoidance. The village is not on any tourist map. It does not appear in regional walking guides. The local council records list it under a category that translates from an archaic Welsh administrative designation to something approximating discontinued habitation. Reason contested. Contested. That single bureaucratic word contains 83 years of horror. The ivy has consumed most of the stone cottages. It moves over the walls not like decoration but like something intentional, something covering a wound. Doors hang on single hinges. Windows that haven't shattered retain their original glass, that pre-war glass with its subtle imperfections, its slight waviness, so that what you see through it is never quite what is there, always something adjacently real, something half a degree removed from accuracy. In the window of the largest cottage on the eastern row, a child's wooden rocking horse sits in motionless suspension, preserved beneath a gauze of dust and spiderweb, its painted eyes fixed on the middle distance with an expression that does not belong on the face of a toy. Wind moves through the broken roof lines and produces, not the howl you expect, but something far more unsettling, a low, nearly subsonic exhalation, as though the valley is breathing through clenched teeth. As though it has learned, over 8 decades of holding silence, to move air without sound, to exhale without voice. 3 generations, 83 years, 31 adults, their children, and their children's children. Not one spoken syllable among any of them. Not because they could not speak. Because they had heard something that convinced them, with the absolute and irreversible certainty of religious conversion, that speaking was the most dangerous thing a human being could do. Part 2. The Timeline. To understand what happened in Harrow's Dip, you need to understand what Harrow's Dip was before the silence began, because places that fall into darkness are always comprehensible only in contrast to the light they once held. Parish records from the 1930s describe a village of ordinary vitality. 47 residents at its peak, predominantly farming families whose surnames, Coulthwaite, Price, Abernethy, Fenn, had been attached to this valley land for 4 and 5 generations before the catastrophe. There was a public house, a one-room schoolhouse, a church whose congregation was small but, by all accounts from neighboring villages, notably fervent in their singing. The Harrow's Dip Harvest Festival, held each September, was known throughout the county for the quality of its communal music. The voices that rose from that valley on those evenings carried up and over the ridge lines and could be heard, people said, as far as 3 miles distant. The last harvest festival took place in September 1940. The following September, no music rose from the valley. No voices carried over the ridges. Neighboring farmers who traded with Harrow's Dip residents began to notice, around the autumn of 1941, that their counterparts had stopped speaking during transactions. They communicated by written note, by gesture, by a system of hand signals that appeared to outside observers to have been developed with surprising sophistication and speed, as though the village had been planning for this silence long before it began. By 1943, the last resident of Harrow's Dip who maintained contact with the outside world, a woman named Betta Price, who made a monthly journey to the market town of Kington to sell preserved goods, stopped coming. A welfare check conducted by a local constable in the spring of 1944 found the village inhabited, functional, apparently healthy, and completely, deliberately, implacably silent. The constable's report, filed at Herefordshire County Constabulary, is 4 lines long. The final line reads, Residents appear well-nourished and in good health. They declined to speak and communicated by written slate. I am unable to determine the nature or cause of this behavior, and recommend the matter be referred to someone with relevant expertise. I did not feel, upon reflection, that I wished to remain in the valley after dark. No one with relevant expertise was ever sent. The village was left to its silence. Children were born there, the second generation, into a world in which the human voice did not exist. Not suppressed, not whispered, not hummed beneath the breath. Absent. The way certain colors are absent in certain forms of blindness, not as a loss that is felt, but as a category of experience that simply never opens. These children grew up communicating through the sign language their parents had developed, a language that researchers who examined the diaries and documented hand signal guides found to be remarkably complete, possessing tenses, subordinate clauses, irony, endearment, and at least 3 distinct registers of formality. What it did not possess was any equivalent gesture for the spoken word. There was no sign in the Harrow's dip system meaning to speak or voice or sound of a human mouth. The researchers initially assumed this was an oversight. They later concluded it was deliberate erasure. The second generation had been raised in a conceptual world from which vocalization had been surgically removed, the way you might remove a word from a child's vocabulary before they learn it. Not censorship, but something closer to prophylaxis. The third generation, born to parents who had never heard a human voice, raised in a silence now 2 generations deep, were by any external measure entirely nonverbal. Not mute in the clinical sense. Not impaired. Simply and completely adapted to a world in which the larynx was not a tool of communication but merely an anatomical structure, like the appendix, performing no function that life required. The last of the third generation died in the winter of 1989. The grave marker, a flat stone with hand-carved symbols from the village's gestural language, was the final addition to the small cemetery at the edge of the village, behind the old church. The symbols have since been partially translated. They read approximately, "She saw clearly. She never endangered anyone. She left no sound behind her." After that, Harrow's dip was simply empty. And silent. And waiting in the way that places shaped by specific human terror sometimes wait. Not passively, not inertly, but with the particular patient attention of something that knows what it wants and understands that time is not a constraint. Part 3. The Diaries. The leather journal was found beneath the floorboards of the largest cottage in the spring of 2018 by a pair of urban explorers whose footage of the discovery was uploaded to the internet and subsequently viewed 11 million times before being removed. Not by the platform, but at the request of the Herefordshire Archaeological Trust, who cited preservation concerns. Those who saw the video before its removal described the moment of discovery with a consistency that is itself notable. The explorers pried up the floorboard, exposed the waxcloth package beneath, and then both of them stopped moving simultaneously, as though the silence of the house had suddenly become visible, had become a physical medium they were immersed in. One of them later said in an interview that she had experienced, in that moment, the overwhelming certainty that she should not make any noise. That her voice, specifically her voice, would cause something irreversible. She had no explanation for this feeling and described it as the most purely terrified she had ever been. She said it lasted approximately 4 seconds. She said it felt like 4 hours. The journal belonged to Maren Coulthwaite. Her handwriting on the cover page is controlled and deliberate, the letters slightly larger than her earlier correspondence, of which examples exist in the county archives, as though she has unconsciously understood that written words must now carry the full weight of everything she will no longer say aloud. The first entry is dated September 3, 1941, 2 years before the constable's welfare visit. The silence had already been in place for what she describes as nearly 3 weeks. "We made our decision at dawn," she writes. "Every family, every soul who remained. 31 of us gathered at the well in the center of the square, and we passed the agreement around like communion bread. First as a spoken proposal, which I confess felt dangerous even then, even in that first moment of saying it aloud, and then as a written page that each of us signed. No one hesitated. That surprised me. I had expected at least one person to falter, to hold their pen above the paper and ask whether we were being rash, whether there was some other way. But we had all heard what Aldric heard. We had all seen what the hearing had done to him. No one hesitated. Aldric Coulthwaite, Maren's husband, appears throughout the early entries as a man fundamentally and catastrophically altered. Prior to the summer of 1941, she describes him through accumulated domestic detail. His tendency to sing while repairing fence posts. His habit of narrating his own actions aloud in the kitchen. His laugh, which she characterizes in a phrase that has since been cited by researchers studying the diaries as one of the most quietly devastating lines in the entire collection. His laugh was the sound the house made when it was happy. After what she refers to, with a restraint that reads as deliberate, as the event on the Eastern Ridge. She never describes it directly, never names it, never writes what the sound was, only its effects, only its aftermath. Aldric becomes a figure she describes with the careful, bereaved precision of someone writing about a person who has died and been replaced by someone wearing his face. He does not sleep, she writes, in an entry from late August 1941. He sits in the kitchen chair with his back to the room and his face to the wall, and I cannot tell, from the set of his shoulders, whether he is awake or in some state between waking and other things. When I speak to him he flinches. Not sharply. Not the way you flinch from a sudden loud noise. Slowly. As though each word I say is something entering him incrementally, pressing through skin, and the flinch is his body's attempt to close around the entry point. I have begun to speak to him less. I have begun to move through our house as quietly as I am able. Last night I caught myself holding my breath simply to cross the kitchen floor, and I stood in the dark on the cold stone and I thought, this is how it begins. The final conversation she records with Aldric, which she notes with the retrospective clarity of someone writing after the fact, she did not know was the final one, is brief. He had looked at her directly for the first time in weeks. His eyes, she writes, had the quality of eyes that have seen something so far outside the range of what eyes are designed to process that the aperture has simply widened and not returned to normal size. He said, the worst part is not the sound itself. The worst part is what it showed me about all other sounds. All sounds. Including yours. Including every voice I have ever loved. He said, it is like being shown the skeleton beneath the face of someone you love. You cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to seeing only the face. Every voice now, yours, the children's, my own, everything, carries the shadow of that other thing inside it, underneath it, like a frequency running below what the ear can normally reach. And now I can reach it. Now I always reach it. He said, I think the only mercy would be to stop. 3 days after this conversation, Aldric Coulthwaite drove a knitting needle through his left eardrum. When that proved insufficient, he could still hear the muffled cotton-wrapped diminishment of his wife's weeping, and it was still impossibly underlaid by that frequency. He repeated the procedure with his right. He survived. He was, by Maren's account, immediately and profoundly calmer. He slept that night for the first time in 6 weeks. In the morning he came to breakfast and sat at the table and ate, and his shoulders were level, and his eyes had returned to something approximating their former depth. He could not hear her. He could not hear anything. And the relief on his face was so complete, so naked, that Maren writes she had to leave the room. I stood in the yard, she writes, in the cold morning, and I thought about what that relief meant. I thought about what it said about the thing he had heard. That deafness, that deliberate, self-inflicted, permanent deafness, was preferable to hearing my voice, was a mercy. And I thought, if that is what sound has become for him, then what is sound? What are we doing when we open our mouths and push air through that small, terrible aperture in our throats? What are we broadcasting without knowing it, into the air of this valley? What are we inviting when we call out into this particular dark? The gathering at the well happened 4 days later. The agreement was signed. The silence began. Part 4. The biology of chosen quiet. Dr. Priya Anand, a vocal anatomist at University College London who spent 18 months examining the skeletal remains excavated from the Harrow's Dip Cemetery in 2019 and 2020, describes her findings with a particular careful understatement of a scientist who has spent considerable time locating clinical language for something that resists it at every turn. In a normally functioning adult larynx, she explains, the intrinsic muscles, the cricothyroid, the thyroarytenoid, the lateral cricoarytenoid, maintain a baseline level of tone even during extended periods of sleep or unconsciousness. They do not fully atrophy without either significant neurological insult or complete, sustained disuse over a period of many decades. What we found in the first-generation remains from Harrow's dip was consistent with the latter. Muscle attachment sites on the laryngeal cartilage showed remodeling patterns that indicated profound, long-term non-use. These individuals were not physiologically incapable of speech. Their anatomy had simply begun the slow process of reclassifying vocalization as a vestigial behavior, a function that, receiving no signals of use, the body was cautiously beginning to dismantle. More disturbing were the findings from the smaller remains. The children of the first generation, born after the vow but before the silence had fully calcified into something hereditary, showed laryngeal development profiles that diverged from standard pediatric benchmarks in ways that could not be explained by simple disuse. The hyoid bone, that small, suspended, horseshoe-shaped structure that anchors the tongue musculature and provides the foundational support for the entire vocal apparatus, displayed subtle but measurable morphological differences. Differences that were, Dr. Anand emphasizes, not pathological, not malformed, simply reorganized around a different functional priority. The body, receiving no instruction to fully develop the infrastructure of speech, had begun quietly repurposing the machinery. What we were seeing, she says, was adaptation in a direction we don't have good framework for, because we have almost no historical examples of voluntary, complete, multigenerational non-use of a primary human communication system. The closest analogies in the literature are communities of hereditary deaf individuals where spoken language was never the primary modality. But even there, the vocal anatomy typically develops along standard lines because the infants are exposed to ambient speech sound from the surrounding world. The Harrow's dip children were not. They were raised in a community that had eliminated not just their own vocal production but, as far as was architecturally possible, their exposure to recorded, broadcast, or ambient human speech. They had, in effect, been raised inside a controlled acoustic environment designed to ensure that the voice, the human voice, any human voice, was something they never encountered. The third generation, those who died in the late 1980s, showed this adaptation at its most complete. Their vocal anatomy had reorganized itself around silence the way a stream reorganizes around a permanent obstacle, not broken, not absent, but rerouted so thoroughly that the original path becomes, over time, difficult to identify. The laryngeal cartilages had calcified in positions consistent with a lifetime of held stillness. The vocal folds themselves, preserved in 2 cases through the unusual mineral composition of the valley's soil, which had produced a partial natural mummification, were present but showed adhesion patterns that Dr. Anand carefully describes as suggesting that phonation, the actual production of voiced sound, would have been, by the end of these individuals' lives, either extremely painful or completely impossible without medical intervention. They had silenced themselves, she says, at a structural level, not metaphorically, not behaviorally, structurally. The third generation of Harrow's dip could not have spoken even if they had wanted to. The capacity had been, through a combination of developmental non-use and what I can only describe as an epigenetic inheritance of silence, effectively closed. She pauses here for a long moment before adding, with the specific discomfort of a scientist approaching the edges of her field, "What I cannot explain, and I want to be clear that this is where I have to stop speaking as a scientist and start speaking as someone who simply does not know, is the speed of it. Epigenetic modification typically requires many generations to express at a structural anatomical level. What we saw in Harrow's dip happened across 3. That's not impossible, but it requires an environmental pressure of extraordinary intensity. Something that was not just shaping behavior but reaching into the developmental process itself and redirecting it. Something that made silence not just preferable but necessary. Something that the body of the valley, if you'll allow me the metaphor, was actively enforcing. Part 5. The Eastern Ridge. No one has definitively identified what Aldric Coulthwaite heard on the Eastern Ridge in the summer of 1941. Maren's diary gestures toward it obliquely in 4 separate entries, always approaching and then retreating, always finding the moment where language fails, and this in a woman whose written voice is, throughout the rest of the journals, precise and observational and remarkably unafraid. Whatever she is circling, it is not circled from authorial inadequacy. It is circled from something closer to the care you take when walking around a covered pit. You note the dimensions. You do not step to the edge and look down. What she does record. Aldric had gone to check on livestock grazing the upper meadow near the eastern ridge on the evening of August 9, 1941. He had gone alone. He had taken a lantern. He returned 4 hours later, after dark had fully settled, without the lantern. She does not know when he put it down or why, and his first act upon entering the house was to take her face in both his hands and open his mouth and then close it again, and repeat this motion twice more, as though testing whether the mechanism of speech still functioned. As though checking whether the thing that had happened was already inside him, already rewriting the basic grammar of what a mouth was for. He did speak. That night he spoke. But Maren writes that the voice that came out of him was wrong in a way she cannot specify. Not in quality, not in volume, but in some property she has no word for, some acoustic characteristic that made the hair on her arms rise and made her feel, inexplicably, that the words he was saying were also being said by something else at the same time, in a register just below what she could hear, and that the lower voice was saying something different. Later diary entries from other village residents, discovered in subsequent excavations of additional cottages, confirm that Aldric shared what he had experienced in those first days with several other men in the community. Exactly what he told them is not recorded. What is recorded are the responses. Owen Price writes in a journal of his own that after hearing Aldric's account he walked directly home, sat down at his kitchen table, and was unable to stand for approximately 2 hours because his legs, he writes, would not carry him anywhere. He writes, "I have heard frightening things in my life. I have heard the sounds of men dying. I was at Dunkirk. I have never heard anything that made my body simply refuse to function. It is not what Aldric described that did this. It is that I believed him completely, instantly, without reservation, as though the part of me that normally evaluates such things had heard his words and immediately stood aside, because it recognized something in them, something that did not need evaluating. Something it already knew." The last entry in Maren's diary is dated November 14, 1967. She would have been, by this point, in her late 60s. Aldric had died the previous year. Of a cardiac event, the cause recorded on a death certificate that one of the village residents had somehow obtained and filed without making any acoustic contact with the outside world. The entry is short. It is the shortest entry in any of the recovered diaries. Sometimes at night she writes, "I hear it. Not with my ears. Aldric's mercy is not available to me, and I would not have taken it regardless, for the children's sake, for the sake of watching their faces and understanding them. But in the place behind hearing, in the frequency that Aldric said was always there, beneath every sound, since that night on the ridge. I hear it the way you sometimes see something in your peripheral vision that is gone when you turn to look directly. The way a word sits at the edge of remembering. It is patient. It is extraordinarily patient. I think it does not experience time the way we do. I think it has been here long before the valley had a name. I think it does not want to be heard. I think what it wants is to hear. I think that is what sound is here. I think that is what we were doing all those years, singing at harvest, laughing across fields, calling to each other over distances. Without knowing it, without any way to know it, we were feeding it. We were speaking directly into its ear. And I think when Aldric went to the eastern ridge that August, he did not hear it calling. I think it heard him coming. I think it had been waiting since the first human voice ever rose in this valley, for someone to come close enough to understand. I think Aldric was simply the first one standing near enough to the wall to hear what was on the other side of it. And I think whatever passed between them in that exchange, whatever Aldric understood in those 4 hours alone in the dark on the ridge, changed not just him but the quality of this place. Changed the air. Changed what it means to make a sound here. Because we are still here, we 31 who signed the agreement, and our children and their children, and we have been silent for 26 years, and in all that silence I have never once felt safe. But I have felt, underneath the fear, something that is almost gratitude. Because I know now what our voices were for, in this valley, in this particular configuration of stone and slope and air. And silence, whatever else it costs, is the only thing that does not feed it. The journal ends there. There are 17 blank pages remaining. She did not fill them. Epilogue. The valley now. Harrow's dip remains standing. The Archaeological Trust completed its primary excavation in 2021 and recommended that the site be preserved rather than developed, citing its historical significance. The recommendation was accepted. Perimeter fence was installed. Signs were posted describing the village as a site of ethnographic and social historical interest, and noting that entry was restricted to authorized researchers. The signs do not mention the silence. Researchers who have spent extended time in the valley for academic purposes report, with a consistency that no one in an official capacity has yet been willing to formally address, a range of experiences that resist straightforward explanation. Several describe a marked reluctance to speak aloud while inside the village boundaries. Not a prohibition, not a decision, but a reluctance that presents as instinctive, as pre-rational, as arising from some evaluative layer below conscious thought. 2 researchers have independently reported that during overnight stays authorized for documentation purposes, they became aware, sometime in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, of a sensation they describe with different words. Pressure, attention, proximity being heard, but which correlates with such precision across their separate accounts that the similarity is difficult to dismiss. One of them, a cultural anthropologist from Cardiff University who has published extensively on Harrow's dip and agreed to speak about her personal experiences only on condition of anonymity, describes it this way. I have been in many places that people describe as having a particular atmosphere, a weight or resonance that goes beyond the merely architectural or historical. I have always been skeptical of this. I remain, professionally, skeptical of it. But I will tell you that on the second night I spent alone in that village, I woke at approximately 3 in the morning with the absolute, unambiguous conviction that I should not breathe loudly. Not that I was in danger. Not that something was going to happen to me. Simply that the act of making noise, any noise, was something I should not do in that place at that hour. And the conviction was not mine. It did not feel like a thought I had generated. It felt like a thought that had been placed in me, carefully, by something that was listening very closely and did not want the listening interrupted. Pauses. I did not speak again until I was back in my car, with the engine running and the radio on the main road, 1.5 miles from the valley. And even then the first words felt strange, intrusive, like shouting in a library, like breaking something that should have been kept whole. She has not returned to Harrow's dip since that second night. The rocking horse is still in the window of the eastern cottage. Researchers have discussed removing it for preservation purposes. No one has yet done so. The reasons given vary. Logistical concerns, funding constraints, the complexity of disturbing an active research site. These are all valid reasons. They are all also, in the estimation of everyone involved, not entirely the whole truth. The whole truth is simpler and harder to write in a funding report. The whole truth is that no one who has stood in that valley and looked at the rocking horse in the window, mid-rock, forever suspended, painted eyes forward, has felt entirely comfortable with the idea of touching it, of making, in the act of moving it, any sound at all. The valley is quiet. It has been quiet for 83 years. Something in the valley is listening. It has been listening for much longer than that. The diaries of Harrow's dip are currently held in the restricted archive of the Herefordshire Archaeological Trust. Requests for access may be submitted in writing. Telephone inquiries are not accepted. No explanation is given for this policy. None is needed.